with that introduction all done, it is my pleasure to introduce John Meredith, who I've been working with through the ecosystem, and his time at NWIS for probably about 2.5 years, talking about a range of topics, but openEHR is the one that he's most passionate about and has been involved in sort of really some interesting projects, and is going to kick off today's event. John, I'll hand over to you.
Thanks very much, Helen. Yeah, it seems like eternity actually since we've known each other, and I haven't stopped bleating on about this openEHR stuff. Yeah, to start us off with a couple of questions. We're interested where you are joining us from today. Obviously, the geographical boundaries. This is the benefit of COVID, isn't it? Opening up something as a webinar and making it available to everybody. And we're seeing, wow, look at this: Germany, Netherlands, fantastic. So yes, by all means, please let us know where you're joining us from today. The next question: what is your knowledge of openEHR? We're going to ask this now, and we'll also ask it at the end, and hopefully by the time you get to the end, we'll see a big uptake, and everyone will be much more knowledgeable. But yeah, basic, good, ripe, fresh minds available to be informed. Excellent stuff. And the next question: what is your interest in openEHR? Obviously, part of today's event is about learning. It's about us being able to disseminate some information, but certainly we'd like to know what your where your heads are, essentially, if that's okay. So right, let's get on with it, I reckon. Now let's check to see whether or not I do this correctly, because I always end up falling foul. I was adamant that I was going to present my own screen, and this is the downside of it. So hopefully you can all see that.
Yeah, you can see that, John. Excellent.
Right. I'll start. So yes, I'm John Meredith. I'm a technical architect. I work for the NHS Wales Informatics Service. And as mentioned, we hope that you find today informative. You find this session, you can learn about something new if you're not haven't been exposed to it before, and hopefully if you are au fait with openEHR, you'll be able to just deepen your knowledge. I thought I'd start with this story about how we've sort of got to this point. For myself, there has been a journey that's been littered with examples of projects I've been involved with since I've joined NWIS. But this is not just a historical recap. It's also because we're starting something else. We're about to kick off a 2-year project to deploy openEHR for some specific use cases to support some the Accelerating Cancer Programme, and also some NDR, National Data Resource related use cases as well. So this is about the beginning of something, and hopefully you'll get something out of it. First off, what is openEHR, or what is openEHR? Right, officially it's supposed to be openEHR because it sounds cool. If you say either, nobody's going to shoot you, it'll be fine. But I have been asked what is the difference between the two, and the point is there is no difference. So whichever one you hear, don't worry about it. The openEHR journey, certainly for me, came when I was asked to be the technical lead on the National Diabetes Management Solution, Wisdom. Off the back of that, we had new requirements for the data storage, for data persistence. And it's suffice to say that some of the elements that we were talking about, amongst the 3,000 new data elements that we found during our business analysis for diabetes, many were unique. Many were not present or able to be stored using national repositories or national components across NHS Wales, and some of those were very, very useful outside of the sphere of diabetes, such as for nursing documentation, cardiology. The saving of blood pressure, for example, is a pretty universal use case. Body mass index, smoking status for smoking cessation services, and all those sorts of things. These are sorts of data items that contribute to the longitudinal patient record. They facilitate reading and updating of the clinical data record as required, supporting use cases that are described by a variety of different tools. One of the early examples was us looking at sitting down with clinicians to describe what are the data items that we're talking about. And even though I hadn't been exposed to openEHR at this point, what we naturally started to do was put boundaries around things, put a boundary around blood pressure, a boundary around pulse, and all of the other elements there. And also then the wider boundary that sits around something like a formal assessment, in this case, like a foot assessment. Those data structures are inherently understood by the clinicians involved. You know, it represents the clinical process and represents clinical workflow. And the challenge was always how you represent that in a structured data format. One of the issues that we had, though, is that, you know, we didn't have that structured data repository. This is a reasonably old schematic, but is useful to describe that, you know, there are a whole range of national data, you know, national architecture components. You know, we had, for example, the Welsh Care Record Service, that is our document store. We've got results and pathology results, for example, that you inhabit within the Welsh Results Reporting Service, amongst a variety of different things and different systems and processes in place. But we didn't have that store for structured data. We couldn't store adverse reactions, for example, or find blood pressures. They might have been in different places. You know, you could query the GP system, for example, but it wasn't that, you know, kind of a once for Wales kind of approach, or a single source of truth. And that was a particular concern to me when I was working on the diabetes process. And how could we, you know, represent a single source of truth in terms of the systems? And so we started to look at the requirement of a structured data repository, or a clinical data repository, as we determine it here, a smart data store, essentially, which is natively storing and allowing the retrieval of data, etc., etc. So the single source of truth approach separates two principal elements. You've got the clinical model, and then you've got the structured data persistence itself. Now, this is really important if we're seeking to have control over how the data is stored. If we're going to do this in a uniform way, the model that underpins that data has to, by definition, become a definitive standard. It has to be a solid foundation. But when that data item is used again or requires change, we also need the ability to effect change over that model without it actually breaking anything else. So the clinical model is intrinsically important to the data persistence. And of course, once you persist that data, you can use it. So could we use some form of tool to provide a single source of truth approach to support the definition, capture, storage, and then reuse of clinical data across NHS Wales and across beyond? You know, we need to be able to, as well, to send data, interoperate with health and other partners across boundaries. So we started to look at this technology called openEHR, and we initiated an 18-month project to cover 4 key areas. Firstly, legacy data, easing the burden on repositories such as the Care Record Service, as I described. You know, they're starting to be used as proxy data repositories, which of course, you know, you can put data into those repositories, well-structured data, for example, but then you have to do something to get it out. So, you know, there's an engineering overhead there. The second point we were looking at was end-to-end platform development. So, you know, observing openEHR as a platform from first principles, business requirements, through to development of a demonstrator app. Third, then looking at the service layer to support these concepts of interoperabilities, the APIs, essentially, are they fit for purpose? Can it also support data migration? How do you query the data? Is it effective, etc., etc.? And then the fourth point there, clinical data standards, the modeling and governance tools associated with it. But essentially, we're talking about a building block approach. Now, anybody that's seen me talk before knows that I throw Lego at everything. So here's some more Lego for you. You know, this, you put a whole bunch of little building blocks together, and what do you end up with? Well, you end up with something like a discharge advice letter or something along those lines. I have no idea why General Zod is the reason for encounter, but it kind of makes sense. And everyone can agree that Yoda should be a diagnosis archetype, I think. Oh, I mentioned the word archetype. Right, I'm gonna be very. I'm not going to get into too much detail here, but I'm gonna, before I hand off to my colleague Ian McNichol, I'm going to sort of describe what the most basic way of describing openEHR is. And And this is kind of important because there's a learning curve to this. And we don't expect everybody that's going to go through today to have a eureka moment and say, yeah, this makes perfect sense, or even to understand it enough to question if it is of use. I believe it obviously is, but there is a learning curve associated with this. But fundamentally, openEHR is a specification, and it comprises of two key elements: the clinical models and then the rules that govern them. This is a reflection of that separation of concerns that I was talking about earlier on, or the single source of truth kind of approach. So you have this content model, which describes all of the rules, including how terminologies are used, for example, and it contains a very important component they call the reference information model. Don't worry if that doesn't mean anything to you, absolutely fine. But the other side of the coin here is the archetype object model and the description of these things called archetypes, which are these little building blocks like blood pressure or something along those lines. And and their manifestation then as a clinical use case in the form of a template. So I'd now like to hand over to Ian McNichol, who's going to do something rather interesting and describe what's so important about openEHR and why it is different.
Okay, good morning, everyone. Thanks for your attention. It's my job to take you through some of the aspects of openEHR. We are trying to say openEHR just because it's easier and consistent, but as John says, openEHR, openEHR, exactly the same thing. So what's different about it and who else is using it? Just a little background for me. So I used to be a Scottish GP. I now live and work in England. I'm a director of openEHR International, a little more on that in a second. I got into computing many years ago when my first little computer was the ZX Spectrum you see there. I'm also into whiskey, but was very much a late developer there, but I'm making up for lost time in my appreciation of the fine Scotch malts. So what's openEHR? As John says, it's an open specification. It's about patient-centric healthcare information. And the critical thing is it envisages a world where the data is stored separately from the apps. Now, it doesn't have to be a single store. And John's talked about there being a single source of truth. It doesn't have to work that way. There are many examples of where we hold the data in a more federated way. In other words, there are potentially multiple data stores, but the data is in principle stored separately from the apps, and that's not how the majority of the industry works right now. It's designed to be vendor neutral, technology neutral, and license neutral. So although openEHR itself is an open specification, we allow both open source and closed source applications and other technology to be built around that. The critical thing is that everything is based on the open standard and the specification, and that lets the ecosystem work. openEHR International is a not-for-profit collaborative based in the UK, and is essentially a collaboration between industry partners, clinicians and clinical informaticians like myself, and health organisations. That's our website address, openehr.org. So what is it we're trying to get to? And I guess the challenge that we have in health and healthcare is that what we really would like is a patient-centred and coherent information system. And the problem is that the actual healthcare system under the hood is anything but coherent. And in some ways it isn't terribly patient-centred. Although we all work with patients, we have to work within organisations, and we have to work according to our specialties or care pathways or whatever. So that tends to push us into an environment where everything gets a bit siloed. And traditionally, the applications follow the silos. So they follow the silos of application, so they follow the silos of our specialties, whether it's GP or some other of our organisations or our care pathways. And the problem is it's very difficult to reconcile all of that. Once you get everything in individual applications, stitching it all back together again is extremely difficult. The other challenge that people have when they're building health and social care applications is just the sheer complexity of the data. So this is a slide that I love sharing from our colleagues in Germany in the HIMED organisation. And this is an example of a real-world database data schema for actually just one, I think, hospital EPR. So this isn't the whole thing. And this is someone's attempt to turn the complexity of the data they're handling into a traditional relational database schema. It's extremely burdensome. And of course, the problem is that things keep changing all the time. So people spend a lot of time trying to manage the data under the hood. We come at things from a very different angle. What we're increasingly talking about is this open platform architecture, where, as I said before, you separate the apps from the data stores. In openEHR, we have this idea of technology and vendor neutral data stores we call CDRs, clinical data repositories. And in between, we have this vendor and technology neutral information model. And essentially, that is the openEHR part. So the openEHR part defines the information models and all the standards that go around that. Then people build apps on top of that, but they also build these specialized data store CDRs that understand the openEHR story. We use tools to do that, to build those information models. John's talked about some of the Lego bricks, the archetypes and the templates, and you'll see some more of that already. So we have custom tooling to enable us to do that. The tool on the left is Archetype Designer that allows us to build those little Lego blocks, the archetypes and templates. The one on the right is a tool called Clinical Knowledge Manager, and we use that to review and store and act as a library of particularly international and national archetypes. So how do archetypes and templates relate? So ultimately, this is about building what we call templates that underpin a data set. So there we've got an example of a diabetic checkup app, and within that there is a data set that records issue and weight and blood pressure. But a different template underpinning, let's say, a cardiology app, a cardiology clinic app. And again, we've got what's the problem, what's the weight, what's the patient's blood pressure. And what we do is to build these common components that can be used in both templates and indeed both apps. And they can be cross-queried, and that's the critical thing. We're not locking the data into any one individual apps, but we're shaping the data so it can be used in different apps. Very important to say is that this is not about forms, all right? And it's not about building apps per se. The same template, the cardiology clinic, can be used by a different physical app. So it can be used by a desktop app, by a patient app, by a clinically focused app. So we're building the data models, we're not building the apps or the user interfaces. Really good example, if you want a story of how quickly we can do this, is what we did, well, like it was almost just over a year ago when COVID-19 kicked off, and there was a really agile, multinational effort to build a variety of COVID applications underpinned by COVID-specific archetypes. In fact, we had a lot of the archetypes already, because again, this is about building up a library of pre-built components that we can use to move things forward quickly. There's a very good little workshop that we did. The YouTube videos are there. One of the most interesting ones is the one in the bottom right, which was colleagues in China. And there's quite a big Chinese openEHR community, and they did a lot of work very early on in terms of COVID assessment and data capture for decision support. One thing just to talk about, because it is a particular part of the openEHR story, is this idea of the clinical data repository, which is a bit of technology. It's a kit, not kit, it's a bit of kit. And essentially that's a smart data store. Which natively stores, retrieves, and queries openEHR data via standard API. Critically, all of the data within the CDR is completely available to the community. Now, obviously, there are the usual governance issues. You know, making it completely available is in theory. Who gets access to that? Who gets to read and write? That's an issue of governance for the community that own the CDR, the data store. It's not anything that's locked into the vendor. The community who owns that CDR from a governance point of view has complete access to that data, and it's up to them to decide. So the vendor can't block what data gets exposed. The people, by vendor there, I mean the people who supply the CDR as a technology. All of the data is available through this vendor neutral querying level called EQL, which is based on the data models, not based on the vendor's technology. And we can deploy those archetypes and templates very quickly to the CDR without requiring any engineering. So it moves the control from the vendor, the person who's supplying the data store a bit of technology, moves the control to the owner. And in this case, this would be NHS Wales or NHS Scotland. So this is examples of the API and query language. We won't talk about this today. The next workshop will go into this area much more. This is starting to become something which internationally people are recognizing as a major shift in the way that we build health systems. If people want a high-level view, this is a very good paper that was created by Ernst & Young, now called EY. The link is there. And they talk very much about this idea of data repositories independent from EHRs or EPRs from the applications. This we think very much is the way of the future, rather than the more traditional best of breed, where we try to just stitch together different apps storing their own data. Does it work? Yeah, absolutely. It works at scale. We've got examples of openEHR systems working on millions of patients. The biggest one in the world is the city of Moscow. 30 million patients, all of their outpatient and GP services running on an openEHR platform. Other examples are GP systems in Norway, hospital systems in Norway. There's a huge number of, growing number of applications across the UK and beyond, many different areas using this. So we know that it works in practice, applications big and small, working across the world. In the UK, I won't go through these individually, but we've got an increasing number of trusts, particularly in England, using openEHR as part of their story. We're starting to get, if you like, the shared care record project coming on site. Can't say too much about that just yet, but you should hear about that imminently. We've also got increasingly numbers of platform instances, NHS Wales being one, NHS Scotland's National Digital Platform is another. There's an Oceanic platform in Northern Ireland, and a whole number of other projects going ahead. So this is absolutely real and growing. The National Digital Platform, I won't go through this in detail, but basically the principles are exactly what John espoused for Wales. It is about having a single digital record for patients in Scotland, and increasingly getting applications to talk to the National Digital Platform rather than doing their own thing. But we need multiple applications. This is not about getting rid of many applications. It's not about having one single application run by the NHS. We need independent applications to be built on top of the platform. Okay, that's me got to the end of my time. openEHR International is, as is a not-for-profit, and it is a very good community. As you can see from the picture, we like our beer. So please join us, either as an institution or an organisation, or as an individual member. It only costs €15 to join up as an individual member. All of the IP is free to access. Everything that you hear about, unless we say otherwise, is free to access and use. We ask our members to pay a small fee, and that's largely to get involved with voting people like me in and out of office and influencing the direction of openEHR in the future. Okay, thanks very much. I'll stop there.
You've got to start again, Ian.
Oh, I've got to start again. Oh, geez. Right, so I've got to start again. Oh, I thought I could go for a cup of tea, but no chance. I'm back to it's me. It's me again. It's me again. Okay, at this point, I'm going to just take you further into this story of archetypes and templates, because there is a technical layer sitting underneath this. But the important thing, I think, for this audience is the very exciting area of archetypes and templates that I've been working with probably for 10 or 15 years now. So what are we talking about? Well, we're talking really about getting clinical knowledge out of applications, out of individual systems, and into the open. So, a typical journey of an application, and this is an application that I'm helping build. It's a care home app, which is about patient monitoring. And here's the question that the app developers, or indeed the clinicians, will ask. Will say, I need to record a bunch of data points in my application. I want to record the pulse rate. So the challenge we have there is how do you get, so there's pulse rate there. How do we get pulse rate from the application on the screen with maybe a little, control on the screen? How do we get that from the app, from the user interface? Excuse me, lunch waited, or sort of breakfast coming back. How do we get that into a technical format that can be stored and brought back again and queried? Because I probably want to do other things like calculate a new score, or indeed do some kind of monitoring over time and graph that data, or share it for research purposes. To do that, I need to get this data from my user interface in my app into some kind of data store and get it back out in a standardized format. And this is this is JSON, which is a technical language. And you can see there's the pulse rate, the magnitude of 63, and what are the units. So how do we get that standardization? Standardization has been tricky in the health and social care space because the data is so complex. So here's if you like, a very traditional way of doing this, what people might call a data dictionary, and you'll see examples of this. We've certainly got one in Scotland. I'm sure there's one in Wales. There's definitely one in England and around the world. We've got, if you like, the data dictionary approach, and this is an example of the Glasgow Coma scale, which is a scale developed, funnily enough, in Glasgow, to assess levels of consciousness. And this is one part of it, which is the eye-opening part of it. And you can see it's got a bunch of numbers, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So 1, 2, 3, and there's the relation. So these are the codes, and these codes are attached to the data dictionary, but it's got these relevant scores. So the first problem here is we can see that the scores are not actually part of the standard. Now, these are just text descriptions. Data dictionaries often come up with standard ways of working which are applicable for reporting purposes, but they're no good for doing frontline application development. So data dictionaries, yes, sometimes we can get useful information out and working for reporting or some level of analytics, but usually not at a level that will work for frontline systems. So the kind of industry standard way of defining data models and data standards in a neutral way is a language called UML, Unified Modeling Language, which works perfectly well. So this is the Glasgow Coma scale expressed in UML. This came from a Dutch group, and it's got SNOMED bindings in there as well. Yeah, this is perfectly good, and a technologist could turn this back into some kind of programming language or whatever, but that requires work, and also it's not terribly friendly for a clinical audience. Yeah, geeky clinicians like me can turn that into can understand it, but a lot of clinicians will look at that and go, I have no idea what that means. The other problem we have with standard ways of developing data models is that very often the ways that people work mix up the clinical aspects of the things that clinicians need to think about and agree on, but they mix them up with the technical ones. So if I just start clicking away here, you'll see that the items in green are essentially, this is an allergies model. This is part of an older version of Microsoft Health Vault, which was Microsoft's attempt to do a little bit of health data standardization. So we've got the code of the allergy, what type it was, what was the date, when was it first observed, and is it negated? In other words, was this not an allergy, which is a really bad way of doing this. Leaving that aside, these are all reasonable things for a clinical audience to comment on and decide if that makes sense. However, we've got all of these other things that are exposed as part of the Health Vault model. These are technical items, and they don't make sense to clinicians, and they don't need to see them. So OpenEHR tries to address that by splitting out the technical aspects. The reference model. This is, if you like, this is the technical architecture, those technical bits that you saw on the previous screen. And then we split out these components of archetypes, and from the components, we then build the end-use data sets called templates. Those of you who know about terminology like SNOMED and LOINC, this is not a separate thing. We're not competing with terminologies. We make use of the terminologies and archetypes and templates. So not a separate thing or a competing idea, very much a collaboration between the two. OpenEHR has this very generic record structure. So when we store data in the CDR, it is stored in this kind of pattern. Not go into this, it's not necessary at the moment to go into detail, but there's a very rigid kind of railroad that we have to go by when we store data in OpenEHR. But these are just kind of heading-like structures. The real detail is stored within the archetype. So the reference model gives us generic technical artifacts. It's got generic structures and types. It defines that overall health record structure. Everything runs on a kind of clear pattern. It talks about security and versioning. It talks about how to handle people, things like dates and times. And it's expressed in this very technical language. There's a whole set of specifications. that the people who are building the CDRs and the people who are building the tooling need to understand. But it's deliberately hidden in those clinical modelling tools, and those of us who are clinicians and clinical informaticians don't really need to see it or talk about it very much. What we want to look at are these idea of archetypes. So these are models of discrete clinical concepts, components of a health record, blood pressures, body weights, medication orders, family histories. Here's the Glasgow Coma scale expressed as an archetype. It's much clearer, much easier to understand. We have a maximal data set philosophy when we're building these things to try to capture as many clinical perspectives as possible. We've got ideas of compositions. So these are generic document types like a problem list or a discharge summary or an end-of-life care plan. But the composition archetypes are very simple. They don't define detailed clinical content. The important thing about clinical data, about compositions rather, is that all clinical data is saved inside composition. So it's a kind of like a document way of saving data, but we can pull data back at a much more granular level. Most of the archetypes reflect what we call the clinical process. So the idea that, first of all, we see a patient, we look at previous results, we maybe take a history, we do some physical examinations, then we make some kind of decision. What do we think the problem is? What are the risks involved? Then on the basis of our decision makings, we maybe we issue some instructions or orders, and then there's a series of actions that come out of that. We give a medication, or we do a referral, or we see a patient. So there's this continuous cycle of going from observables to make some decision making to instructions and actions. And the openEHR archetypes are grouped into that setting. So observation archetypes are about the gathering of evidence, about measurable and observables, patient histories, lab tests, scores and scales. And the vast majority of archetypes are actually observation archetypes. So here's an example of capillary refill time. And you can see there's a whole lot of things in there, which may be much more than any one particular clinician or clinical group wants to use. And this is captured in this idea of a maximal data set. Then we go on to evaluations. I think the problem is, I think there's a risk of, so here's an example, an adverse reaction risk. And again, we've got a whole lot of data points there that are in the adverse reaction risk archetype that any one set of clinicians may not want to use. It's overkill particularly, but it does reflect the kind of variation of ideas that are out there. And it's up to us as clinicians in a more local context to decide exactly what we want to do in terms of adverse reaction risk recording. Interesting, this was something that was we co-produced this or co-designed it with our FIRE colleagues. So the allergy and tolerance resource is almost identical in terms of its content. Instructions are about orders. I'd like to order some blood tests. I'd like to start medication. Again, here's a very complex archetype medication order, which again is very similar to the equivalent FIRE resource, but it's what we use to record essentially prescriptions. And then actions are what happens as a result of those instructions or orders. And here is an action archetype, which is about handling the outcome of a request for a service. So that's something like request to do nursing tasks or a request for a referral. And the interesting thing about actions is it allows us to handle not just that the request has been performed or done, but all the other states that might be there. So, oh, sorry, we've had to postpone this service. Maybe we had to postpone a request for vaccination because the patient is unwell, or we've actually had to abort it. So the action archetypes allow us to handle not just that the thing is done, but all the stages leading up to the action being performed or perhaps being cancelled. Templates are about bringing those components together for real data sets. So here's the template that we developed for the Welsh hepatitis C assessment. At the top is an encounter composition. Then we've got down at the bottom, we've got these are actually problem diagnosis archetypes labeled as comorbidity and comorbidity other. There we've got some lab test archetypes, and there we've got some imaging archetypes down at the bottom here. So all about bringing together these little components. And I think something like 70% of the components are actually come from the international archetype repository. And then one or two others were developed locally for the Welsh use case. And that's what we're always doing, bringing together a number of pre-built components, but adding some ourselves. Some of these will be very local and they will never go outside Wales or Scotland or wherever they've been developed. But some of them, of course, have got generic use. So we'd want people to feed these back to the international community. So these are very much about use cases. So here's something that's much more in the social setting. Again, this is a big growth area we've got at the moment. There's a lot of work happening. Finland, Scotland, and the Netherlands, and coming into England as well, about managing social care data sets. And of course, there's a huge overlap. We know this, particularly from COVID, interest in the challenges we've all had around care homes and COVID and care homes. There's huge interest in this area. And this is an example of a form and the underlying archetypes that we're trying to use to model that form. Very important to note that we're not trying to build forms. We're trying to build the data sets that sit underneath the forms. You will see in a session coming up using templates to build forms, but actually the templates are not forms. There's something that can sit below them and can actually help generate them, but they're not the same thing. So templates are the workhorse. Archetypes tend to get the glory in terms of the thing, but the templates deliver the data sets. So the end point where, for me as a clinical informatician, I build the templates and then I hand them over to technical colleagues. They upload them to the CDRs, they become their data definitions, they don't have to do any re-engineering, but we also use them to generate all sorts of other artifacts like forms, like class libraries. And although we do tend to talk a lot about archetypes and archetype modeling, a lot of the demand for archetype content will actually originate as requests for data sets. So we often work backwards from building templates and then identifying the gaps through which we have to build some new archetypes. Okay, and I'm not at all sure how we're going for time because I've lost all my notes, but we've got a little break now. And we'll be starting back at 11:05. So I think I'm on time, which is a slight miracle in these things.
So thank you, Ian. But actually, in the break, we'd like people to consider a Mentimeter question. So we're just putting a question that we'd like you to answer on the screen. As you can see, a number of people have already gone there. Are you using openEHR in use in your organisation? And you know, if you can fill that in, and obviously go and refill your coffees and teas, and we'll be back, as Ian said, at 11:05. Thank you. Well, I can see from the chat there's quite a lot of conversation going on, so I imagine that everybody's been able to refresh themselves and get sort of ready for the next sessions. I know we've covered a lot. I've finally understood what an archetype is, so that was a great presentation, really helpful. And the break was there, I think, also to give Ian a bit of a break from speaking, because we're about to hand back over to him. So Ian, if you'd like to move on to the next topic in our event this morning.
So the next session I always approach with some trepidation. I'm very aware, having done similar sessions for many years, that the whole ideas in openEHR can seem quite overwhelming. They're challenging to everybody, and I had the same difficulties at the start. There's a whole lot of new ideas in there. The idea that clinicians should actually be directly contributing to data models, the fact that we're no longer talking directly to databases, that we've got those kind of no engineering, no code data stores. All of it seems a little bit fanciful, and I know that often technical colleagues particularly struggle with some of those ideas. So we found from experience that it's actually very helpful at this point to really just do a little demo to show an end-to-end example of how it all works. I should say that don't expect to understand exactly what's happening. I'm going to go deliberately quickly. John's generously given me 35 minutes to do this end-to-end demo. So don't expect to follow. This is not for you to follow and try it for yourselves. It's merely to see that there is an ecosystem there which is very rich and allows us to work very quickly at pace and build new data sets and new apps very quickly. So that's better. So I've given myself 30 minutes. So if someone on the team, could you give me a shout at when 15 minutes has gone by, and also when I've got 5 minutes left, so that I just make sure I get my timing right, because I'm going to rattle on. Again, don't worry about the details. It's more the principles that I want to be able to prove to you at the end of this time that we can actually do things very, very quickly. So the example I've chosen, and this is a new one for me, so genuinely I haven't done this before. Normally I do something like a nursing assessment, but this one, I thought, let's try something new. A number of places, a number of clients that I've been working with have been talking about doing something, building some kind of app, to support a long COVID pathway, people with post-COVID syndrome. There was a report came out from NICE and RCGP just last week that had a whole lot of guidance. So I've picked up some of that and said, okay, let's have an idea about what we would build for a long COVID pathway application. It's a bit rough and ready. I wouldn't pretend this is polished. It needs a lot more thought, but let's give it a go. So long COVID pathway application is what I'm going to try to build. I won't manage to cover all of that content, but you should get an idea of how the ecosystem works. You're going to see me using a number of tools. The first is one called Archetype Designer, which is available free from openEHR. You can see there. You can sign up with sort of Google or Facebook or GitHub login. It can store data locally or in the cloud. It can also download archetypes from the CKM and import them. And we can also export archetypes from here and upload them to the CKM tool. It is a commercial tool, but it's provided free for use to the openEHR community. And I believe that NHS Wales has their own copy of this, their own instance of this. That doesn't really matter too much in the details for now. So the other tool that you'll see me use very, very briefly is the CKM Clinical Knowledge Manager tool. So again, this is a commercial tool, but it's available free to use to the openEHR community. There are two key CKMs that we use in the UK. One is the international one, and one that is managed as a sort of cross-UK collaborative. NHS Wales, NHS Scotland, and some English regions and Ireland contribute to that. It's all about maintaining an international library. It's about reviewing archetypes, making sure they're fit for purpose, and sharing them widely. Although it's a commercial tool, as I say, it's free to use. The international one certainly is free for the international community to use. And all of the archetypes and templates are also mirrored into a thing called Git or GitHub. Those of you who are technical will understand that, but that's basically an open access repository. So you don't need to go to the CKM tool to get access to the archetypes that are held there. So these are the two, if you like, openEHR tools. The third tool that you're going to see is one called Better Studio, and that's provided by the company Better, who I understand are providing likely to be providing the kit in Wales. This is something that's essentially provided as a value add by the CDR manufacturer, in this case Better Care, and I'm using it because it sort of acts as a kind of CDR utility. For those of you who work with databases, it's kind of like the tools that you get with SQL Server or Postgres. It allows you to manipulate the data, upload templates. It has an AQL builder, so it's a nice way of building these query statements, and it also has a form builder tool. But these are essentially add-ons to the openEHR story. They're very nice to have. You'll see we can do stuff quite quickly with them, but they are not a key part of openEHR as such. Okay, so on to the demo, and just a second while I switch things. Are people seeing my screen okay?
Yep.
Cool. So this is the Archetype Designer. I'm going to start building this long COVID template. Again, don't worry about the details. I'll talk as I go through, but I don't expect people to really follow in detail what I'm doing. I just want you to see the magic emerge. All right, so I'm going to start by building this template. It has a composition archetype at the top, and I'm going to just choose a very generic one called encounter, which just means some kind of face-to-face, or there's a patient and a clinician having some sort of encounter or dialogue, and we'll call that long COVID demo, v0. We'll create that. Up comes this new screen, and I'm now going to, I've got my, this is my composition at the top. I'm going to rename that as long COVID assessment. So this is for an individual assessment. Patient comes in, they get a single assessment. So I'm going to start out by adding some general headings. I quite like the S-bar kind of headings that a lot of people in emergency settings use: situation, background. So these are what we call section archetypes. They're just for headings. They don't have any real meaning, but it helps us break up a complex template. Section, background, assessment, and we'll just create another one, response. So what I'm doing is picking up from a library of archetypes. So you can see all the archetypes that I've got in my local library. So many of these will have been downloaded into my local environment. So this is my working environment, and we'll have downloaded these from the international repository. Or some will have come from the Aperta CKM rather than the international one. And this is a section archetype. It's a generic one called ad hoc heading, and I'm renaming it there. Okay, into situation, I'm going to start to add some archetypes. And the first one I'm going to add is reason for encounter. Why are you here, essentially? I've added it in there. Here it is. And I don't need contact type. I just need to know what the presenting problem is. In other words, why is the person here? And I'm going to add in some just little essentially drop downs. So I'm going to put in suspected post-COVID syndrome, and let's just put another one, known. Review. Okay, so the first one would be for probably the first time the patient comes. Second would be, look, we're just we know they've got this post-COVID syndrome. So this is that reason for encounter archetype. I can open it up and see it there, but this is the one that has been developed by the international community. So let's just go to the openEHR CKM and see where that came from. So this is one that's been developed by the international community, and why have I not got it there? Here it comes, reason for encounter. Okay, it's got a green tick there, it means it's been published. There it is in the international space, and what somebody has done, probably me at some point, is to export that, download it into my local copy here, because you always have to manage your local assets. You're always downloading things. Those of you who build software will recognize that's exactly the way that software developers work with open source systems. But it's a pre-built component that I can then use. I don't have to build this thing myself. So let's get back to the long COVID demo. That's me got my reason for encounter. Next one I'm going to do is to add in the idea of the problems. So if I just quickly go back to the long COVID pathway, here we've got this idea of under background, we've got a little problem list that says what's the primary diagnosis, what are the complications, what are the other problems. What I've done just to make things quicker and easier is to do a little, I've lost it now. If I just do, I think it's, come on. I think it's that's one. Yeah, COVID contextual problems. So what I've done here is to pre-cook a tiny kind of mini template that already has a lot of these archetypes included. And that is not what I meant to do. I meant to press this button. So press this button, you'll see that here is another international archetype called problem diagnosis. But I've pre-cooked this, and I pre-cooked it to bring in this pattern of the primary problem, the complications, and the other issues. These are based on generic archetypes. Now, again, we'd probably put in some SNOMED codes or something here to say what is the original problem. You can see here that a lot of things have been grayed out. Right, so the original archetype, if we look at it, just click on here, has got all of these data points: problem diagnosis, description, date time of onset, severity, diagnostic certainty. But in this particular environment, we don't need all of these things. The clinical community that's come up with this saying that we just need the name and the date time clinically recognised. This is the idea of the maximum data set, but what we've done in the template is to take these things out. I'll just temporarily put this one back in again. It says you can have one of these things. Now I click on this and it says, no, I don't want that in. So we're shrinking the data set. We're shaping it to fit the local use case. The value of this, of course, if somebody does come and say, no, actually, we do need a bit of text, we need a clinical description, then we can very easily just do that and it's immediately available. And it also means we're capturing all of the ideas that the clinical community internationally think they need as part of a problem diagnosis. Okay, so that's the problems aspect done. So we've done situation, we've got background. I'm going to go into, and sorry, under background, I meant to put in symptoms. So again, what are the COVID symptoms? And again, I've pre-cooked this one. In fact, I realized I've got a COVID symptoms set of archetypes that we have prepared already. This was done for a Scottish project for a care home assessment app that is gone into production now. So this is something, again, a pre-cooked pattern. Now, it probably needs a little bit of revision because, you know, the understanding of symptomatology for COVID has moved on since this was done about a year ago. Again, we've got these pre-cooked components that we can use and bring back into other templates. And if the data had been recorded in this care home app and stored in the same data repository, we could cross-query them, right? So we could pick up symptoms that COVID suspected symptoms that have been collected by a different app because it's all sitting in the same patient-centric longitudinal data store. Right, so that's our symptoms done. Let's move on to assessment. And here again, I'm going to pick up a bunch of archetypes that have already been developed to save time. Vital signs. Again, this is based on the care home app we're talking about already. And if we just scroll down, here we've got vitals, so body temperature, pulse oximetry, pulse and heartbeat. Actually, one that's missing because I deliberately hacked it and took it out is blood pressure. So let's just go to the international repository and we say, okay, for some reason, somebody's missed out blood pressure for vital signs. That's a bit weird, but that was their decision. So, but we need to take blood pressure now. So I do a search for blood pressure. This is in the international space. And it's gone to sleep. There we go. We'll download that, export to ADL. So it's stored onto my machine. I go back to the archetype tool. I choose import. I can pick this up, drag it on there, upload it. It's actually saying, I think it is there actually, after all, just tell me it would overwrite it. So I'll just choose overwrite existing and then retry. That means I get the very latest version. Okay, and now I should be able to find blood pressure version 2, uploaded a few seconds ago. That's the one I want. And it's got a whole lot of data points there that I don't need. Fortunately, there's a little, we call it the snowflake button, which takes out everything that isn't mandatory. In the archetypes, we can define things as being mandatory, but we very rarely make anything mandatory. So I'm just going to take out, put in systolic and diastolic, and basically everything else is constrained out. Okay, let me just save that as I go along. So that's my vitals done. And if we go back and look, there's one other thing that I'm going to add, and it's just to show you us building a bit of a new archetype. Which is the Yorkshire Score. So the Yorkshire Score is a new assessment tool that's been developed in Yorkshire by these people here, the COVID-19 Yorkshire Rehab Screen. And when we go down, you'll see there's a whole bunch of things there, opening questions, scales, essentially scores around breathlessness, laryngeal airway complications, voice swallowing, nutrition, blah, blah, blah. There are many, many of these things, and some people in Newcastle have developed something not dissimilar. So this is part of the guidance that this is a useful tool to be used when doing post-COVID syndrome assessment. So let's have a go, and I'm going to copy this over onto a different screen so that I can follow it. So you'll just have to trust me that I'm doing the right thing. So earlier today I had a little go at starting to build this thing just to save time. So here we have the, if I just pull this over, here are the opening questions. Have you had any further medical problems or readmission? Have you been readmitted, yes, no, and any details? So that's my first two data points, further problems or readmission. And I've done that as a little choice of coded entries. We have here, there's where we record the other details, and there's where the details of other health services are used to record. The next bit down is breathlessness. So on a scale of 1 to 10, with 0 being breathless, not at all, etc., etc. Breathlessness at rest, breathlessness on dressing yourself, and we've got breathlessness now and breathlessness pre-COVID. So it's starting to turn out to be a complicated little assessment tool. I've made a start there, so I've done breathlessness now. Breathlessness at rest is a count from 0 to 10, and there's something a bit weird about this. I'm just going to close this down and open it again because the something's got scrambled in the UI. Let's just open this up. Yeah, that's better. This little bit wasn't displaying. Okay, so
Ian, sorry, yep. You're at 15 minutes.
I'm at 15 minutes. Thank you very much. Okay, so this is breathlessness at rest, and these were things that have been either text or coded text. This is a count, a number. So there we've expressed it as a count, and we put in a validation range so that we're saying this can't be higher than 10 or lower than 0. Let me show how I would do a new one if we pick up voice. So this, have you or your family noticed any changes, yes or no? Let's go here. The swallowing. So let's just go on the count, and I need to set the range of the count to 0 to 10. So at the moment, the raw score is 0 to 1. Let's change that 0 to 10. Okay. And we can add another little cluster here. So we'll say breathlessness originally, and we'll add another count there. And again, I can make that 0 to 10. Okay, I'm not going to go into this because you can see it takes some time, but we can do this very quickly, and it doesn't take very long to train clinicians and clinical informaticians how to use this kind of thing. So building these scales and scores and getting a head around the tooling doesn't take very long. It's much harder to understand the full informatics picture, and we'll get into that a little bit more. So this is definitely half cooked. It's not done by any means, but I guess you see this is the process of what we do to build an archetype. Having built that archetype, I now go back to my long COVID demo. I'll close that up, and we'll add this Yorkshire scale to my template. All right, so completely new. Here you can see the stuff that I've done. There's the thing that I've just entered. All right, let's say that's now finished. Okay, my job now is done. Essentially, my job building archetypes and templates is finished. And as a clinical informatician or a clinician, this is my job essentially done. What I have to do now is to export this to the CDR. Now, this could be done by me or it could be done by technical colleagues, but this is the kind of technical handover. I create this thing called an OPT file, and details don't matter. It's just a big XML file for those who are technical. And now at this point, I'm going to jump to another tool. I'm going to jump to the EHR Studio tool, and I'm going to import this template. Now, all of this, for those of you who are technical, is we can do all of this without using this tool. It's all accessible through the openEHR API. So I can upload this template to a CDR via the API rather than using this tooling. But the tooling's obviously easier for people to understand when I'm doing a demo. So let's just go and we'll do our form builder. And I've got to find that demo, and I've forgotten what it's called. What did I call it? Long COVID demo. Go to templates. Here it is here. Okay, just uploaded it. Literally completely new. So I'm flying by the seat of my pants at this point. So here's our little template. You can see, so this is now inside the CDR, and this tooling is looking at the CDR's view of the template. So it understands everything that's in there. What we can do now is to drag and drop this over here. And you can see it starts to make a half decent job of creating some data points all the way down through the symptoms, durations, stuff. It's a bit messy. You know, it needs a bit of tidying up, and there's lots of facilities within this tooling to make things easier to use. But if we go all the way down, we should eventually come to, there's our Yorkshire Rehab Score. And I've done something stupid when I built this archetype. So I'm going to take some of these things out just to make it easier to build. So there we've got our breathlessness at rest, and there's our further problems of readmission. Remember, so there's the yes, no tick there. Used health services, yes, no. So it's picking up the little data points that we created and the little value sets that we created in the template. Okay, I'm just going to take that out as well, make it easier. All right, so now we're ready to go. We can do a preview on this form. And this is now running live, all right? If I start entering, there's that suspected COVID syndrome that was in there already. I can add that in, and you'll see on the left-hand side, I'm starting to populate this little blob of JSON, all right? So this is the technical format that's going to be sent to the CDR. So I'm just going to put in long COVID as the problem diagnosis, or COVID, that's new. Okay, and I'm going to put a date there. We'll say there's no complications or other issues. Several months, feeling irritable. You can tell my typing is shocking. There's all sorts of other stuff. I could go through, I'll just add a temperature of 36.7, make sure it's degrees Celsius, and we'll add a pulse rate of 93. Essentially, that's me done, all right? So I am now going to save this composition, and this is saving the data to the CDR, to this smart data store. I could point it, this is currently pointing to a better CDR, but I should be able to point this data at a different CDR from a different company, and it would work exactly the same way. And similarly, the process of uploading the template. So I've now saved this data. How do I know I've saved it? Okay, so now we go to the magic of AQL. I'm going to the AQL builder, and we'll look and we'll bring up our long COVID template. And what I'm going to do is just pick up the whole template and run the query. Right, so don't worry about the query language. It's a bit weird. We'll be talking about that, I think, in the next session next week. But fundamentally, you can think of all of the information for every patient that's stored in the CDR is accessible through this. And it's obviously about choosing particular patients or particular contexts. What I've asked it to do there is to bring back all of the data that we stored. And if we scroll right through, you can see there's the presenting problem, suspected COVID syndrome. There's all sorts of, there's the problem diagnosis name. If that was SNOMED coded, that would be handled as well. There's my story, feeling terrible for several months, blah, 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 influenza symptoms, blah, 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 all the way through. And there's the Yorkshire Rehab Store with the problems of readmission and used health services, yes. So this CDR didn't know anything about the Yorkshire Rehab Score 5 minutes ago or 10 minutes ago when I built it and submitted it. That is the beauty of moving this so quickly. I can make this a lot simpler. So as well, instead of pulling back the whole template or the whole composition, I can say, look, just give me what did we have? Further problems or readmission. Just give me back that single data point, and it gives me back yes. Or I can say, give me that and the temperature. No, wrong one, Ian, wrong one. That was the one. Okay, so give me back these things. So we've got, so we can shape the data, and indeed, at the moment, this is actually looking at every patient rather than a single patient, but we can shape it to have particular context. We could even say, in fact, this is looking across multiple compositions. This particular way I've constructed this query, if a patient had, in fact, let's just try an OR here. If we do an OR, with a bit of luck, we may get more data points. Yeah, we do. All right. So what I've changed that query, again, don't worry about the details, but I've said, look, give me back a list of compositions in this system which either have a Yorkshire rehab score in it or have a body temperature. And because we're working with a demo system, there's a whole other bunch of compositions there that have temperatures in them. So we're working across compositions when we're doing the queries. We've stored the data through a specific template in composition, but brought it back through, regardless, agnostic of the way that the data is stored. And of course, that makes things extremely powerful. It all has to be governed and controlled, and we'll talk about this in a later session. And I think that's probably me jumped all the way through. For those of you who are technical, the final thing is just to say, what does this look like under the hood? So this little tool is just doing a visualization of that data. What actually comes back through the API are these, what we call this a result set, which pulls back the data in this structured format and then can be further processed. Okay, and I think that's probably me getting close to time, or have I still got a few minutes?
I think you've got a couple of minutes, Ian.
Well, do you mean 2 minutes or like 7 minutes?
3 minutes.
3 minutes, 3 minutes, that's fine. So one thing I'd like to do, just to prove, I hope that this is, it's not the magic of this tool. I'm going to copy this out. And I didn't, because I've got a couple of minutes left, I'm going to copy this little query out, and I'm going to show you, this is for the technical people, I'm going to show you a different tool called Postman. Okay, so Postman is a technical tool that allows us to talk to APIs, including the CDR. And I'm going to paste this, again, don't worry about the gory details here. I'm going to paste this query in here. And I'm going to run it, and this is probably where it all goes wrong. It did all go wrong because I've done something wrong here. What have I done wrong here? Oh, I know. Apologies. That's better. Okay, now if we run that, we get the same data. All right, so this is talking to the standard openEHR REST API. We'll be talking a bit more on that next week. But this is what's happening under the hood. This is a little curl request. It's a post, sends it to that endpoint. So this is the technical magic that's happening under the hood for the technical people. Nothing to do with this particular tooling, and that would work against a different CDR that understood the openEHR API. And I'm going to stop there. Hopefully that's giving you a sense of the magic, that we can do stuff really, really fast.
I told a fib, Ian, actually you did have another 5 minutes, but there you go. I put the effort on me now, haven't I?
You can luxuriate, John. You can luxuriate.
That is not something that you need to offer me as an opportunity. Right, let's get this thing to work properly here. Share my content. Now, this section had a title, and you'll notice when my screen appears that I put a big cross on the title, because it dawned on me, it's like telling the punchline of the joke up front. So the original title is one of the things that we're going to lead into, but I thought continuing the story theme and continuing certainly findings of the review, to go through a couple of key points essentially. And there's a much wider report that's kind of like goes with this that we're hoping to make available, but we're not sure how to do it. Principally because it's something that reflects our internal use cases. So some of the examples that we've gone through are really peculiar or particular to the things that we're talking about. But the summary of the findings really is shown that the concepts that Ian has talked about are very pertinent for NHS Wales. You know, this concept of being, you know, data being fully exchangeable with a variety of different components is very important to us. Portability of data, you know, that vendor lock-in has always been important to NHS Wales use cases. We prided ourselves on the ability to have a vendor-neutral archive type approach. Welsh Image Archive Service, for example, our care record service, you know, it's not attributed to one specific black box solution from an individual vendor. One of the other key things is that openEHR is not an all-in approach. Certainly my learning during this process has shown me that we can start small and we can build off the back of that. And that's the route that we've chosen in terms of being able to support some specific use cases as presented by the cancer system replacement. And also then extensible to support, you know, our evolving healthcare record. Ian's already shown you the flexibility in the archetype model, for example. Also, interoperability. Right, I'm going to start using the I word and also use an F word shortly, but it's not the other F word, it's the HL7 FIRE word. But fundamentally, interoperability via shared, clinically driven, validated open models, setting a data standard there. And also the data, the input and the output, how we store data and how we reuse it then is all standards compliant because of that API layer. And we can use, you know, more modern mobile first web services. And again, as Ian's shown, rapid application development, you know, using, you know, an eForm technology that can interact with a template that specifies that clinical use case. So interesting concepts such as, well, if we publish that template, is that our use case? Does that form a specification for an app? Is it a specification for procurement? Whole host of different things come out of this when we start looking at adopting sort of a more open platform orientation. So interoperability. One of the key things here is that what we learned is that openEHR provides a platform component that enables both technical and semantic interoperability. So I'm going to just spend a brief moment just pulling apart these things, but certainly, you know, using, you know, other tools as part of a wider platform, you know, it dawned on us as we progressed. It was less about openEHR and it was more about actually how we could use that with other things like SNOMED, like FIRE. We learned that it supports software development with the necessary constraints at the data persistence layer. You know, we need to basically be able to safeguard, validate that data in terms of how it is used, and ensure that we can try to maintain good quality data as it's stored in this emerging structured way. Also, this supports some of the recommendations that were made with the NHS Wales Architecture Review, which has been published recently. Well, everything seems recent, considering COVID's gotten in the way. It seems like months have smeared out, and I think we're all in this space, unfortunately. So time's a bit elusive. And then also providing a foundational component for a national clinical data repository. Component being the operative word there, you know. So one of my favorite terms is something called interoperable. And I've spent a significant amount of time talking, having the same conversation with people over and over again. So I like to just put this definition of the word out, just so that we can all, you know, sort of understand each other a little bit better. So interoperable, the confused sound of a group of people talking simultaneously about the subject of interoperability without describing the full meaning and subcategorization within a specialist domain such as health. It was exceptionally difficult to understand how I could connect to my data above the din of interoperable. Jokes aside, if I have a penny for every time I hear SNOMED CT is going to solve our structural data problems, or FHIR is the answer to interoperability, I could retire at my ripe old age of 40, whatever it is. It's not that simple, but there is a way forward in using multiple solutions together to balance the different facets of interoperability. So, you know, the legitimate confusion between what technologies like openEHR and FHIR actually do is acknowledged. Something I seem to worry about initially, and then it sort of dawned on me roughly around a year ago that there's actually a process here about understanding how these tools can work together. openEHR and FHIR are both standards. We don't just have to pick one, because fundamentally, you know, openEHR and FHIR comparing apples with oranges, and you shouldn't do that because that's a bit nuts, and they are different. There is legitimate confusion between the two because they've both got similar things, similar attributes associated with them. So, for example, Ian's described archetypes. Well, FHIR has something called resources. Now, if you start looking at, say, allergies, there's an allergies resource and there's an allergies archetype. You put those two things together and they look remarkably similar. Well, they look remarkably similar because they were built by the same people at the same time. It was designed as really as a means to try to see if the communities could both work together. But the allergies models are actually an outlier, because generally FHIR resources are constrained more at the archetype class. So you remember when Ian was talking about observation types of archetypes? Well, there's an observation resource. So there's a difference in terms of granularity there. Same thing applies to profiles and templates. Even though they both reflect a use case, a FHIR profile is about conformance that allows two systems to communicate. System A speaks to system B, and during that process of sending that message, certain rules can be put into place. Well, the template is there to ensure that the rules of data persistence are put into place, and they might be subtly different. They might be wildly different. Both deal with structured clinical data. However, the levels of granularity are potentially significantly different. But that's not to say they don't work together. So this is a little cheeky tweet screen grab from our colleague Berger. Second shout out today for Berger, who, you know, there's been work going on here on sort of trying to automate or semi-automated, you know, transforms from openEHR. And remember the concept that Ian was talking about, this maximal data model. When you have that maximal kind of approach, you can always constrain it down. You can always abstract specific use cases out of that. It's very much starting with that foundation of that maximal approach. And already it's been shown that actually a lot of these technologies can all work together quite well. So let's look at interoperability. So there's the three main facets of interoperability: technical, semantic, and process. There is a fourth which kind of bounds around this, which is about the human factors, the people in this process, the ability to, you know, to change and all that sort of stuff. I'm going to ignore that for the time being. I'm just going to try to do a very quick fit between each of these technologies. So in terms of FHIR, according to the message theory of interoperability, it's message content that is standardized by FHIR, okay? And it becomes, it supports that conformance requirement for communications. So you can understand why this is attractive to suppliers, because they have a syntax that they can adhere to. And we could publish a specification, for example, that makes use of that syntax. It gives us a common language. I want you to think about the perspective of, you know, receiving a letter through your letterbox. You look at that letter, it has an address on it. You can start to understand what's meant by that envelope. It's maybe addressed to you. When you open it up, your ability to understand the contents is predicated purely on things like what language it's written in, or, you know, whether there are pictures and things like that. It's all about your interpretation. That's what the FHIR syntax allows systems to do, to communicate with each other, to understand. But of course, the content can vary wildly, because of course the message between system A and system B is predicated upon what the problem they're trying to solve. Why are they sending the message in the first instance? So that's why there's a dotted line with semantic there, which is you can derive semantics from a rich structure that could be contained within that message. but that doesn't necessarily mean it's implicit. When you consider SNOMED, though, the clinical terminology is it's a list, it's a range, it's a hierarchy of different terms. And from there, you can derive semantic understanding. But of course, the semantics is relative to how that data model has been constructed in the first instance. Utilizing SNOMED CT in its own right, just as a list of stuff, doesn't necessarily allow you to derive full meaning as to the provenance of that data. In terms of IHC XDS, XDS is one of those nice little acronyms. The X means cross enterprise document sharing, and this has been around quite a while. What we've noticed is that in sort of the open platform community, openEHR adoption tends to go hand in hand with using XDS as basically a set of rules for document persistence. And essentially providing that standard metadata, and then a whole host of services allow you to find and catalog different content. That again is a technical standard. And then finally, then we've got openEHR. So what openEHR is allowing us to do then is basically providing that clinical model that combined in SNOMED CT, for example, provide that rich structure and address this semantic and then the clinical process-based versions of interoperability. Now, I've drawn a dotted line there that goes openEHR to technical. And you could say, well, if openEHR can do all of that, why do we want to use FHIR? Well, because HL7 FHIR is essentially the language of interoperability. It's the language that has emerged that suppliers can adhere to. We're working in an environment here where we need to actually choose the path of least resistance sometimes. And FHIR is a really capable technology, really capable way of sending information between different systems. So it's vital. It's a vital component when it comes to this. But you put all these together and you get what we've started calling the Fox stack, and which essentially is a distillation of health interoperability use cases into a series of deployable components. Each facet of interoperability is covered, whilst there's bleed through, lots of them have APIs, for example. It allows system builders to essentially use each technology as intended. So, single one of these components is a solution in of itself, but together they form a technological foundation for an open platform approach. And this allows us to free the data, to start a campaign of data liberation, because this is what we're noticing now. If you think about your smartphone, for example, the big beasts of global computing, are describing the next leap in software design. It's not visual. It's about the technical problem being the focus of taking all of these silos of data, breaking them down, and then providing a series of services on top that make sense of that data. Right now, apps are living in silos, and that's exactly what's happening in the healthcare space. But you've got Alexa, Google Assistant, whatever you might happen to have on your phone, are doing very clever things like trawling through your Gmail to find out whether or not you've got reservation plans or whether or not you're late for a flight. If we're ever allowed to get on a plane again, I don't know, but you get the point. So in health, we've already chopped up the data silos. We're now seeking that glue, that series of components that can actually make sense of some of these things. So as mentioned, this concept of the open platform really did emerge during the openEHR review, and this concept then of us being able to have standard published APIs, a variety of different APIs, native. We could use openEHR, we could use FHIR, depending on the use case. It's important to note that you shouldn't, necessarily force people down a specific route if it doesn't support that use case. We had some feedback, for example, about the level of complexity in understanding FHIR syntax, and at that time I was guilty of saying, well, why don't we use the openEHR APIs? But then it dawned on me, why would they want to use the openEHR APIs? Maybe we should actually really try to simplify this, which took us in an interesting direction, which I'll go into now. But yes, all of these things, reusable data components, secure data, auditable at scale, and all that sort of stuff. So this separation of concerns, separation of apps and data has now become very important to us in terms of this adoption of the openEHR as part of an open platform, in a way that would allow us to start to transition from that siloed history to this new way of working, essentially. Data stored separately from the applications that collect and edit and display it. The data layer then is helping to deliver data that's standardized in terms of how it's formatted, its nomenclature, terminologies, and definitions, and then it allows it to flow into other systems as specified by the data owner. And the interesting thing is that the good rules for data storage don't tend to change, if much, at all. And persistence ultimately then is supported by, or will support greater interoperability over time, because we've got that solid foundation. And when you look at where the relevant technologies all sorts of fit here, you find, for example, SNOMED actually pervades the entire stack. You can use it as a terminology service that could be used to support transforms. For example, primary care read-coded data, for example, could go through a transforms engine that could convert some of that to SNOMED on its way down to some structured repository further down. FHIR, for example, could act as that common gateway, a series of platform APIs that can be understood, published as a data standard in its own right to support that a specification for software procurement even. And as I mentioned, XDS as that metadata wrap around the document repository. And then finally, we've got openEHR sitting at the bottom as that structured data, feeding some of these other components and taking advantage of them as appropriate. When you think about it in one perspective, we could go out to procure something from a third party or develop our own local application, and really it doesn't make any difference that we're storing it in openEHR, because we can present an API that provides those structures, provides that conformance layer. The fact that it's sitting there in openEHR actually is irrelevant to a certain extent, as long as we've defined what that specification is. So the recommendations of the openEHR review were sort of threefold, well, 2.5-fold, because the third one's not really a recommendation. But first being to adopt openEHR modelling approach to help define the emerging digital record for Wales, thus taking advantage of all the things that Ian's discussed so far. Second thing then being the adoption of openEHR as a clinical data repository component. So there's no silver bullet here, okay? We're not trying to refer to this as being, that there's, we all have to adopt it and we're going to store all the data in it. Absolutely not. We need to continue this learning process. So we need to use specific use cases, approach them in a pragmatic, stepwise kind of way to really understand how this fits part of our national architecture. So that's why our current plan with our project is to start small. And that was then the third recommendation, to help develop a live exemplar project, which is just kicked off in the last few weeks, supporting key deliverables, principally such as this component called the Shared Meds Record, and also supporting treatments as part of the Accelerating Cancer Programme. Essentially, though, we don't want to sell this as being the solution. Reiterate, this is not a silver bullet here, and this is about actually taking a pragmatic approach to multiple tools and multiple technologies, and ensure as well that we can adapt to a new governance process that goes with some of this stuff. And I'll go on about that a little bit later on. Clinical voice, is it important in digital application building? I'd like to think that this is pretty self-explanatory, but we never know. But by all means, please answer it honestly. And if you strongly disagree, we won't hunt you down. We do generally want to understand what your thoughts are.
Well, that 10 minutes went by really quick. So hopefully everybody's had a chance to replenish drinks and so on, and comfortable and ready for the final section of our event this afternoon. So first of all, I'm going to introduce John, who has a mysterious message.
It's not that mysterious. I just wanted to clarify something. So Ian alluded to us working with a company called Better Care as part of the Welsh platform. Just wanted to clarify. So Better were our partner during the openEHR evaluation, the original evaluation, and because they're such nice chaps, I convinced them to let us keep their kit afterwards for proof of concept and things like that. So whilst we are going to be imminently out to procure a range of tooling to support us over the next period, the proof of concept servers and kit that we've got available, they are available for people in NHS Wales to use, and we'll be working over the next couple of weeks to figure out how we can expose those to anybody that's interested. But by all means, if you do want to make use of them, let me know. Either catch up with me later on, etc., etc. It's enough from me, more from Ian, I think.
Absolutely. I was about to introduce Ian with the next topic, semantic coherence and governing open clinical data standards. Now, I know what most of those words mean individually, so hopefully Ian will improve my understanding of what they mean together.
Yeah, it's a good question. When John and I came up with this topic, it's probably my suggestion. I'm not quite sure I knew what I meant when I said that, but let me try and go through it. And I'll try and figure out myself as I go along. I think one of the issues that we see in this complex space is it is hard to get coherence. You know, if everything is locked into individual applications, or indeed locked into individual forms, which is often the case, in sometimes multiple forms for the same kind of data inside an individual application, it's really hard to get that holistic, holistic view of the patient's situation from their record. And it also imposes a huge burden of data entry on staff, which we have to think about as well. But, again, if we just take a few steps back and say, what is it we're trying to achieve? Whatever range of technologies we use and choose, it is to get this idea as best we can of a clean view of what is happening with the patient, what their problems are, and be able to manage them with particular conditions and pathways using our skills, which inevitably are specialized. So we've got to reflect that in the way that we capture the data and the way that we try to standardize that data. So what are some of the challenges that make this kind of standardization so hard? Well, just standardizing healthcare practice is difficult. That's what NICE is all about. That's what sign guidelines in Scotland are all about. So we know that there's a challenge there. Everything, not everybody moves in lockstep. It takes time for the healthcare standards to emerge and to be standardized, and they're always changing. Clinical understanding, clinical knowledge is changing all the time. So inevitably, those healthcare standards themselves change. And that makes it a challenge to reflect these in terms of the digital healthcare data standards or information standards. But lots of things get blamed. Clinical ego. This is how my firm inside my hospital does things. We don't do it the same way as anyone else, and that's certainly true. Although I think those barriers are breaking down. We would have at some point said there was a degree of technophobia inside healthcare practitioners, but I think those days are long gone. The vast majority of staff in almost all sectors have at least, they're used to using the technology for their own purposes at a personal level. And some of the technophobia is that quite a lot of the applications that we present to them are outdated or horrible to use or are challenging. And of course, vendor lock-in is a real problem, but it's not the whole problem. A lot of it is just inherent to the complexity of the data space. We've got these continual new innovations coming out, and very often these are reflected in somebody building their own little app for a registry using a Microsoft Access database or a spreadsheet, or maybe they get a mate to build some little application. More siloed data, doesn't talk to anything else. It certainly isn't integrated into the main clinical systems. It may populate a reporting registry or some other kind of research, but it's rarely integrated into the hospital or GP environment. Then a more tricky problem is the whole issue of information granularity, and fitness for purpose. So if you take an example of something like a family history of breast cancer, there are very widely different views on how granular you need to be, how much detail needs to go in there. Just the fact that there's a family history of breast cancer, that might have been sufficient for me as a GP 15 or 20 years ago. No longer. We need to know the genetic status of that breast cancer and the patient. Obviously, if you're a breast cancer unit, or even more detailed, perhaps a research breast cancer unit, the level of detail that you might want to include in your records is probably way beyond what an individual GP or indeed patient wants. So managing those discrepancies is quite difficult. And another major problem are the kind of organizational constraints. Who do I have to report to and how do I report? Reporting data is often flattened out, and it often asks questions in a way that are not, the questions do not arise in the same way as they do within a frontline clinical system. So typically you will be asked direct questions like, does the patient have diabetes? Yes, no. Whereas, for instance, in the frontline GP system, there is no such question. It is just the patient has a read code or a SNOMED code for diabetes. So there are those there's a lot of complexity in here that's difficult to iron out. The healthcare information standards process historically has been really poor as well. Generally speaking, there's a sort of top-down governance. It tends to be done in committees, very often face-to-face meetings. Vendors get involved very late, and that's a problem because actually a lot of the detailed understanding of what needs to be done around clinical information standards is actually held within vendors. But there have been very good examples of doing that better. So, for instance, the GP to GP project across the UK actually did get the GP vendors very heavily involved in detail in doing good quality clinical standards. The other thing that drives me crazy is the fixed review cycles. Hey, we built our standard, we're not going to change it for 3 years. We really, really can't work that way. We have to work in an agile way where if somebody sees a problem or needs a change, they have to have a way of asking for that change and having it either implemented quickly or being told why it's not going to happen. So we need very clear change request mechanisms, and we haven't had that today, although I think things are changing now. It's just an example of how the maximum data set approach may actually help here, isn't just getting to sort of teasing out the overlap of clinical of clinical data in different systems. So any cardiology record, this just comes from a bit of work I was involved with in Scotland a few years ago. The situation is that the patient needs to be transferred from a local hospital to the National Tertiary Centre in Glasgow. We just need a simple diagnosis, blood pressure and ECG. That's the national e-cardiology record. We're not trying to be clever here. But what do we actually have within those individual systems? So Hospital A has all of these data points. Hospital B has a kind of subset of that, but it has an idea of date recorded, which doesn't quite line up with date of diagnosis. Is that the same thing? Is it not? Do we know? And then the tertiary centre has an event date. It has an idea of diagnosis, but it also has PR interval and QRS interval because they are involved in much more research. So these things are things that are collected routinely. So the maximal data set says, look, let's look at what everyone has and figure out what the maximal pot is. And then we would turn these essentially into archetypes. And we try to figure out where we've got a collision of naming. So it turns out when we talk to the tertiary centre who use this term event date, they actually mean the date of diagnosis. So that's our maximal pot of things. And essentially these would turn into archetypes. That's what we'd record in the archetypes. And then we come down to the template. And the template in a sense is almost like it's like a minimum data set that we create. So this is our contract between these different hospitals that turns out to be the cardiology record. And part of that means, look, maybe you can give us a bit more. So for instance, around the ECG, it turns out, of course, because ECG reports are automated as a rule, they all can report PR interval and QRS interval fairly easily. So, regional hospital A and B say, yeah, we can sign up to that. It's not something we need or we use, but if it's helpful for you, we'll pass it on. So that's the kind of maximal data set approach, and the way that the whole idea of archetypes and templates is as much about helping those clinical and clinical informatics conversations to understand what we're all doing. It's a conversation space that lets us revisit those conversations because we're building the little components. You don't have to go back and build the whole data set. You just go back and have a look at ECG or have a look at like blood pressure if that becomes something which perhaps clinical practice has changed. We also, as part of the openEHR sort of philosophy, have this approach of what you might call distributed governance. In other words, we try to let the people down, at the front line decide on what is a good visual fields archetype standard. So these are published by what we call editors, and the editors is just a small team who would be working probably with an ophthalmology specialist or specialist. We put them out to clinical reviewers who sign up voluntarily to look at the visual acuity archetype of the visual fields, and these people decide on a case-by-case and an archetype by archetype basis which are what we call published and therefore we think are clinically safe and fit for purpose. So this is quite different from, let's say, FHIR, where they publish a whole lot of resources in a batch. We do them individually. There are good reasons for the differences. It doesn't mean FHIR is wrong or we are right, but we think this gives us much more flexibility when we're building systems, which is what openEHR is about. It's not about messaging, but this idea of having a distributed environment, and essentially the implementers, so that's the people that are building apps, pick up the mix of archetypes that they want in order to fulfill their, get the archetypes built. Yes, we need bodies like the PRSB, Faculty of Clinical Informatics, to give kind of secondary endorsement and say, yeah, we also agree that the visual fields archetype is correct, but we don't want them to want this to be a secondary endorsement process, not a primary sign-off, because there's just too many professional bodies around the world that we need to be involved. So we use these tools, the Clinical Knowledge Manager tools, to do this kind of distributed review, distributed governance. You can see some of these things have got green ticks, which means they've been published. Lots more are draft, the grey ones, so they haven't been through the formal publication process. This is our UK Aperta Clinical Knowledge Manager, but we actually take a whole lot of archetypes and templates from the international space, download them into our UK one, and this is our kind of UK source of truth. Versioning is really important. The archetypes change all the time. This is the V1 archetype, this is the V2. This is a view from one of the tools that shows what the changes are, and that's very useful for people like me that are building templates to understand what these changes are. But it's up to me as a local implementer to decide whether to use version 1 or version 2. Those of you who are in the software world will recognize that's the same process when you're dealing with public libraries, open source libraries. It's ultimately down to you to decide which versions of which artifacts you use. So again, it's very much this distributed software development. We've got our Archetype Designer builders here. So this is people like me and John. We're building things, but then they will often be managed inside authoring repositories. We're going to be interacting with the Aperta CKM, but that's a kind of not really a source of truth from the point of view of building apps locally. That's a kind of national or international repository of useful things, which has its own governance cycle. But it's up to us to assemble the components that we use. And we use software development tools like Git and GitHub to actually manage that, to make sure that when these things end up in the operational repositories, which would be inside the CDR, that these are properly controlled and the usual sort of staging that you'd have between them. So in many ways, once you get past the CKM world, we're almost into typical software development processes. I think it's true to say we don't have really good tools here. There's a tool missing to all of us, and that actually includes the fire and SNOMED communities. Something has to manage the Fox stack, to use John's term, to actually make it easier for us to manage all these things, and we just don't have that tool yet. We can do it at the moment, but there is something waiting in the wings to make that easier. So just to draw to a close, this idea, we're trying to get this a patient-centric and semantic. In other words, we understand the meaning is clear but coherent. And right now we have too much information locked inside apps. Even when the apps share information, too much is locked into forms, and even when it's locked into forms, too much is locked into pathways or condition-based data sets. It's bad for patients, and it's a major burden for the service. We had a really interesting Interopen Hack Day. So Interopen is a UK kind of industry-led interoperability community, which does regular hack events. And this is a slide that Neil Robinson of IHE UK introduced from work he's been doing in London, and very much reflects our own thinking in openEHR. The idea that we need to start thinking in terms of core information for a patient, which is global. So things obviously like meds and allergies, and John's alluded to the single shared medication record that a number of people are moving to, a single allergies record, but also what about things like living situation, personal preferences, legal situation, advanced directives? All of these things should be global to the patient. None of these are specific to any one pathway. So there will be a single source of truth for these things. Of course, your app, if it's an end-of-life care app, it's going to be able to look at these and reference them and perhaps update them. So if I've got a breast cancer pathway, I may well want to see all of that information and indeed update some of it, but it's not stored as part of the breast cancer pathway or the end-of-life care plan. It's stored, it has its own little life cycle, it has its own little governance group. And then we've got things like investigation results and MDT meetings, which almost sit apart. But I think this is a model that we're starting to see of these kind of overlapping circles, and at the heart is a whole lot of information which is just about the patient. It's not about a particular pathway. And of course, this is starting to raise issues of we're getting rid of the silos, we're getting rid of the vendor tech organization or indeed individual form silos. And that should give us this widespread read-only access. One of the ideas is we want to have patients really part of that read-only access and very much co-producing their electronic their health records. There's an idea that I commend you to read, partly because I was partly responsible for it, but the idea of a co-produced personal health record ecosystem, which kind of envisages co-PHRs are really EHRs like the National Health Platform, but governance arrangements that allow patients to be fully involved. Oops, beg your pardon. But if we have this kind of world, and I think we're getting there fast, we will need to reintroduce silos by design to protect the data quality for individual pathways or organizations. And that's a new field. We're really on the bleeding edge of this kind of work. So who is trusted to write an update? Okay, and that's just a big, lovely mountain in Italy, just because it makes me feel happy. And that's me done.
And who doesn't like seeing a big, lovely mountain? I don't know, actually. Rhetorical question. Right. I'm mindful that I want to rattle through this last section, if only because there's been a lot of suggestions in the chat, and I think we could get into some interesting spaces. So I'm just going to very briefly describe a couple of the examples where we try to model known requirements or perceived known requirements during the openEHR review. The first of those was the hepatitis C form, which is an e-form that's currently in use across NHS Wales for clinical outpatient appointments. Importantly, it leverages two distinct data sources, one being the Welsh Results Reporting Service to put pathology results inside an e-form, and then there's direct data entry as well. So the goal here was to see how easily the current form could be modelled in using openEHR, testing those modelling toolings and tools, etc., and also how good the fit for archetypes. So it supported our fourth objective, if you cast your mind back for clinical modelling and validation, but also touched on some of the other things as well, because we could see this application essentially as a legacy application. And also, if we then took that reverse engineered template in, put it into a forms engine, actually did it demonstrate we were faster to redevelop if we wanted to, etc. So the modelling turned out quite well, actually, and because if there's one thing I was slightly pessimistic about was this notion that the archetypes are already out there. You don't have to do any re-engineering. Well, we did have to do some re-engineering, but largely speaking, 84% of them were available, were already out there. Interesting tidbit, our colleague Heather Leslie did a little bit of analysis looking at the international CKM and calculated there's around about 8.5 person years of effort has contributed to the published resources that are currently on there, and that's the published resources. So breaking this down, as I said, 84% is already there. 9 of those published, as Ian alluded to before. 11 were a draft. So why is an archetype in draft? Well, could be the model just didn't make it through the final review rounds. It could be that it was adopted locally and the person didn't go back and update it. But generally speaking, the models were already out there. We had to develop 3 genuinely new archetypes, and there was 1 in draft. But this presented an interesting conundrum, essentially. There were 2 different approaches to how we could model that archetype. So specifically, the question concerned it was concerning something called the Child-Pugh score, and it was the difference between whether or not we wanted to capture data as an observation directly into the form, or whether or not the data was already out there and could be pulled in to that form. That approach basically would basically force us to use one archetype type over another. So we've got a decision to make then. Other issues that we came across is, when do we specialize? When do we make a Welsh archetype for something that's out there and is a good enough fit? Or do we actually create something called a child archetype, which is use the overall structure but then add a few bits in which are local to us? And then wider to that, what becomes an established pattern for archetype and template development. Ideas of patterns were quite industry. Sorry, put my teeth back in. Interesting. I better have a drink first. So this is a snippet of a process flow that we use for the capture of allergies with the Welsh adverse reactions application. And as we were going through developing this, this wasn't done in openEHR, by the way, but there is a version of this with openEHR. Essentially, you have a system that queries to see, is the allergies list present? And if it isn't, then it does something, but don't worry about that. We can then ask the question, does the patient have a history of adverse reactions? Well, if they do, we can read that, we can record that as well. But also, if not, we could record what is a negation statement. So that is a statement of positivity that something does not exist. Okay, patient has no known adverse reactions. So that's an important, clinical support element of that model. Additionally, as well, we can capture when that clinical record was reviewed. So that is then being able to make data and make information available to other people that are interacting with that record, that this was last looked at by somebody, date and time, what their role was potentially as well. So we've got two additional archetypes that are also potentially captured at the same time as recording that clinical data. So this obviously leads to, an additional level of complexity that we have to consider here. So, we're establishing rules of best practice, not just in terms of how to implement these models, but how to actually create those models as standard. And when is a standard a standard? So a lot of efforts have gone into some of these models, such as the blood pressure archetype. 62 contributors since May 2014. Do we have to have that conversation about how to capture blood pressure anymore? At what point is that readily acceptable to be absorbed into, a Welsh clinical data standard, for example? The key thing, though, is that we're always going to need that flexibility to support multiple use cases, local or international. Okay, and openEHR and the archetype object model in which you can build archetypes is flexible enough to allow us to reuse and adapt and redevelop as and when we require. But there is this concern about governance and, what international standards we should accept or shouldn't accept. Another project that we were involved with, and I'm grateful for the support from the Wales Cardiac Network here, and you'll hear from Jonathan Goodfellow shortly, is associated with how these tools could be adopted by clinical staff. I was seeking to actually find out whether or not the tools just made native sense to clinicians, or what type of clinician, which is also an important part of that. Are they the digitally aware clinician, or are they the sort of clinician that is just cold-faced and shies away from digital tools, etc., etc.? Because each has a voice in terms of how they could contribute to development. And of course, pulling people into a workshop or into a room is expensive. We've got something called the 6-week rule. You can't just say, can we meet next Tuesday? Clinicians have day jobs, and usually we don't want to be cancelling patients to mess about with digital models and stuff like that. It wouldn't look good, would it? But by sheer accident, I found a chance conversation with Dr. Robert Bleasdale, who introduced me to the Wales Cardiac Network. And what the network had essentially was a problem in that they wanted to define 4 clinical pathways. And so we established that we could actually use openEHR tooling to work on one of those. So we started to work on the acute coronary syndrome pathway. We took it from first principles. So the majority of the modelling in this first instance was done with a combination of myself and Ian. Of course, we had to use that as a learning exercise, and this is important. This learning exercise is something that you can't shortcut it. Hopefully, during the course of today, actually, some of these concepts will start to embed and start to click. But we can't assume that this is just going to happen immediately for everybody, because there is an inherent complexity to how we structure health data. But of this, you can see this mind map type of approach here. You can see a variety of different elements here. There's demographics, referral details, presentation, etc., etc. We've got a risk assessment, whole host of results and treatments and things like that, and then onward referrals, and then a referral review, for example. All of this, barring these 2 green things down here, the Grace Risk Score and the Crusade Bleeding Index, they were all currently available archetypes. We hit an interesting conundrum, though, in terms of where this data set came from. So This is predominantly an audit set data set. So you can see here, there's a question about diabetes, and this, this range, this melange of different data elements. Now, when you break it down, this is actually 3 individual archetypes. No is addressed by whether or not you could query to see whether or not there was a diagnosis code associated with diabetes. The next 3 are all about regimens, and the third then is the date the first diagnosed. By rights, these data items don't sit well with each other. They are shortcutting the semantic context in which they might have originally been captured. But of course, when you have audit systems in place, or you're developing audit systems, you're deliberately trying to shortcut that because the data is not available. So it's a bit of a chicken and an egg situation. A quick pop quiz, and if we were all here, I'd get people to put hands in the air. So I'm just going to shortcut this. Which is the most useful, or which is the least useful, rather? Well, if diabetes is binary, yes or no, actually, it's to all intents and purposes rubbish data. However, all the other 3 options there, I've attributed SNOMED CT codes, each give different perspective. Diabetes mellitus type 2, for example, indicates that there is a diagnosis, but there's additional level of detail to go with that. When was the patient diagnosed, for example? Has it been confirmed? A whole host of other things. The other 2 are showing that there's an element of complication that's associated with the fact that the patient has diabetes. So, this semantic coherence, remember I was talking about semantic interoperability, I was talking about process-based interoperability. You can see it layering up when you've got a robust model for this data to sit within. Anyway, so the outcome of the cardiac network work was that we modeled 2 templates. They're up on the UK-based Clinical Knowledge Manager, and we also created those 2 new archetypes as well. Fundamentally, I think the feedback that came back from the network was really positive, that this makes sense for us, that it makes sense for them as well. So they see value in continuing to do this work. And if it wasn't for pesky COVID getting in the way, we'd hopefully be a bit further along. But hopefully we're going to get to supporting the network later on in the year. But we are talking here about a new way of working. We're talking about a way of building and evolving the emerging digital record in Wales. And the challenge then is about building up that skill set, because we can't assume that we can just chuck this problem at clinicians and hope that they can actually just grab the ball. Some will, some won't. And certainly the feedback we've had for a variety of different workshops that we've held here, whether or not you're a business analyst or you're a developer or you're a clinician, we establish clinical modeling as a discipline in its own right. And so this is the principal challenge that we've got here, where this clinical standards interoperability process really requires almost like a well-oiled machine to start to come into play, where we have the modeling process encapsulated with feeding from the clinical data requirement into building the archetypes into the template that represents the use case. And of course, that template at that point is a clinical data standard referencing a specific use case. But also where we have the interoperability requirement, we have a responsibility to make sure we're developing technical APIs that can be consumed by systems, especially if that system, for example, is something like the allergies record. Now, of course, the allergies record is something that really needs to follow the patient anywhere they go around. And there is some really important work happening with UK core fire profiles associated with NHS Digital right now that we're hoping to feed into, which is about establishing what the allergies record would look like from a technical perspective. But of course, you put these things together, the interoperable layer, the template, and you have a clinical data standard. So who's to assure this? We have assurance groups as it currently stands, which is great. However, are they au fait with now the way of us front loading this clinical modeling process? What openEHR really does is bring front and center the capability for us to do the modeling that would happen anyway, but it does it in a focused way up front, and then uses that as a data artifact in its own right. But nothing can take away the fact that there's complexity, there's engineering to be done here. Whenever you have system A talking to system B, it's an engineering role. And I suppose the take home for this really is that the use of these tools such as openEHR and FHIR really is about simplifying that engineering task, but it doesn't remove it completely. So I'd like to hand over actually to Jonathan Goodfellow, who has been quite instrumental in supporting us going forward.
Yes, so thank you, and I'll just introduce myself then. I'm a cardiologist and I work for the Wales Cardiac Network. That's what I am, but what I'm not is somebody who is traditionally IT literate. To paraphrase Ian earlier, I'm not a geeky clinician. I suppose I'm one of the IT illiterati. Now, the title I'm working to here is no slides, so don't worry if you can't see them. Why openEHR can work for clinicians. Now, like the rest of us, I've listened this morning and this afternoon to the two speakers, and very grateful to both Ian and John. I've heard them speak before, but I've learned more again today about openEHR and how it's going to be useful. But I think it's pretty clear, isn't it, from what you've listened to already, that a patient-centric record, a one record is what we want, because I live in a world where all the data from patients is in silos, and accessing that data as a clinician is difficult, and it leads to problems. So the current system leads to rework. We'll redo tests because we haven't got access to tests. And the advantages of openEHR are real. There's a big patient safety advantage, as illustrated several times talking about allergies. There are lots of advantages to having the data kept separately and made accessible whenever you see a patient. I think from what John was telling you, the story about the cardiac network, Rob Bleasdale was also a cardiologist, my colleague, and he is IT literate, and he's our informatics lead. Did have this chance meeting with John, and we had a clinical problem, or we had several, but looking at clinical pathways, and the one that John was involved with was the acute coronary syndrome pathway. But what we were able to do was bring cardiologists into the room in the days when we were allowed to be in the same room. It was interesting, but I think what we needed right at the start was educating, and Ian educated us on what openEHR was and what the potential of openEHR has for us and our patients particularly. We had to learn the rigor and the importance of having data which was structured, and that we defined the clinical information, the clinical information standards. So we had to learn all that. There's an educational process, and then we had to learn about the different aspects of that, the archetypes. So we were there when we were building the archetype, and then the template. And what we ultimately want to try and do with that system is to build on top of that an app which we would use to do all the things we do now, the referrals of patients along the pathway. And our hope is in doing this, the work we've done so far is going back to the analogy of Lego, is the building blocks. But having an app where we are able to make referrals, and that app would be able to extract the information we need for a national audit, is the vision. And we're not far off it, if I'm honest. So one of the questions that was recent on the Mentimeter was, the clinical voice is very important in digital app building. And I'm obviously going to say yes. I think you do need clinicians involved, whether, if you're purely informatics, you may think they're a nuisance, they don't know what they're talking about. Or you may think they're a nuisance because they think they know what they're talking about. Either way, I do think you need the guys who are going to use your outputs. I've spoken yesterday with John about the approach that I have to this, and it's a bit like buying a car. You need a shiny car that does 0 to 60 in 3 seconds. I'm not that interested in what goes under the bonnet, just as long as the output is what I want it to be. And I would just finish off, because I know there's a lot of questions going to come on. I've enjoyed this morning. I've been educated and entertained by both our speakers. I would say the message really for clinicians is, you need to educate clinicians about what openEHR is and what it brings. And then you need to educate and train clinicians in the use of openEHR, because that's another key thing, I think, that would otherwise be missed. So I think it's very exciting. We are keen to continue. We're putting aside funding for the next year to try and progress the work we've started. And I hope NHS Wales moves to this way of working. I can see it's hugely complex, and you can see there's an awful lot of work that needs to be done behind the scenes and unpicking some of the things that happen now. So on a positive note, I'd say thanks to both our speakers, and hand back to Helen to lead on with a Q&A. Thanks.
Thank you, Jonathan. Actually, we have a good chunk of time that's available for Q&A. So that's a positive, because I can see there's already been a significant amount of debate in the chat. Unfortunately, most of those are questions that are too specific for me to be able to identify. But if there are any questions that anybody would like to put to the panel, if you can put them in the chat, we'll do that. John, have you got a question you'd like to ask the other people on the panel to kick this off? John's thinking there, thinking hard.
Can I address one of the queries that actually came up? You know, I sort of alluded to it, but you know, the ability for us to make use of patterns, I think, is kind of important. You know, you saw Ian use contained templates, and just there's a scalability that's dawned on me. You know, where we create standard patterns. They can be used then in a very modular way. So you're almost getting like this Lego approach, but then you use the construction in a bigger construction, and you build it that way. So there's a scalability as well, which is kind of important, I think.
Thanks,
We've
John.
missed the Menti questions, haven't we?
Yes, I was absolutely going to bring that back in. So we've got the final Menti question of the event. And I think it is, what is your knowledge of openEHR now, after 3 hours of really useful and sort of detailed but not too technical discussions? And I think, you know, people are already starting to put in that poll. I think the interesting thing will be comparing that to where we were back at 10 o'clock this morning. John's just been kicked off again. Teams is not playing with John this morning. But what's interesting is to see the number of people. 25 now saying intermediate or advanced. It is an increase on this morning. So hopefully this has already been a useful session. Just waiting to see. There aren't any real questions coming through on the chat. Just lots of praise for the presentations and clarity of topics. Right, so from Alan Warder, more people talk the talk of open platforms. What is stopping us walking the walk? Ian, do you want to kick off answering that question?
Yes, if I can hit the mute button properly. Yeah, I think there's it's taken time to get some momentum. People needed to get their heads around, this is quite a new way of working. A lot of people who are in the, if you like, the procurement side find it quite difficult to get their head around that they're not actually procuring an application. That's the whole way the system's set up. So there's almost a kind of, hang on a minute, this is we're not in Kansas anymore. So there's that kind of philosophical idea, and it's taken time for the tooling to mature, for the reference sites to come on strong. That people, there's some legitimate questions. Can this thing work at scale? Can you actually make the technology work? So having somewhere like Moscow and other big implementations, those take time to get up to speed and then be able to point to them. But we have now, there are a number of different countries and national organisations either implementing or talking about it, and there's more down the stream that I can't talk about because they're too immature at the moment, and also increasing numbers of just individual companies. So a lot of the interest in the Nordic regions is actually not necessarily countries like Finland and Sweden that are going down the platform road, but individual companies in those countries are just seeing openEHR as a better technology solution for their app. And of course, they're trying to stay in line with any national initiative. So you almost got two threads coming together. But I certainly feel in the last year, we've moved from talking about open platform as a theory to some extent to a reality of things actually happening.
Helen's on mute.
Thank you. John, I'm not sure if you picked up the question. Alan Warder asked, more people are talking about talking the talk about open platforms. What is stopping us from walking the walk?
Yes, Teams unsurreptitiously booted me again. Clearly, it's had enough of me today, so apologies. I could go at any time, to quote a character from Gilbert Grape. Yeah, Alan, it's one of the things that I've learned throughout utilizing openEHR is the description about the benefits that it could provide for NHS Wales, and I think early doors it scared a lot of people off because we weren't exactly constraining it outside of this magical black box that we need to do it once for Wales, so then everything's going to go into it. And I think it set the hairs racing a little bit. And what we've learned recently really is about focusing on the use case and really taking advantage of that finding that we can approach this in a stepwise way. Now, that's not to say we can't adopt a small scale approach to the open platform. That's what we're trying to do at the moment with regards to supporting the cancer use cases and things like that. So the next 12 months really are about establishing that pattern of work, establishing what components we need. As well. So it's not just about the Fox stack as I've described it, but within that sort of middle platform layer, do we need a new eForms engine, for example? A whole host of other things to come off the back of that. Internally in NWIS, we've done a lot of good work with our own Fire server, for example, which is going to be surfacing the adverse reactions data, certainly internally in WCP, and then hopefully later on in the year make it available to other consumers. But that in of itself, do we need a more professional, scalable version? Can we build our own components? Actually, can we adopt an open source CDR? So there's a whole host of sort of, well, from your perspective, probably dull and boring elements and answers that we need to come across here. But it's really about really solidifying what are our requirements. So I think everyone agrees the approach kind of makes sense. We have to take the next step really now to start to nail down how we approach this in a sort of a scalable way. So this is all learning what we're gonna hit over the next 12 months.
Thank you. And Jonathan, as somebody who walked the walk, how difficult was that, or or unexpected challenges that you came across?
I'm getting there, hopefully. There we go. I think the difficult bit was understanding from scratch what openEHR was. Somebody like myself who's not into IT, it was, what are we talking about, and how do I get my colleagues engaged with this? So luckily, as in most specialties and most clinicians, there are people who are really engaged in IT and really interested, and Rob Bleasdale was such a person, and he's a cardiologist, who basically explained to us upfront what it was or what it might be able to do. And we managed to get our clinicians, I can't remember the numbers, about a dozen or more each time in the room. Ian was there the first time and gave us an overview of openEHR. And I have to say, it became easier as you understood the potential of what we were talking about. And then the next lesson was, what is it that we as clinicians have to do as partners in making this work? And that was quite difficult, to be honest. The working through the definitions, the debates we had to nail down specifics, But again, once it was done, you do it once, it's agreed, and that's it, it's done. And then the forms which we will generate from the templates will enable us, I think, to capture all the right information when people go through a pathway. So that's the next bit of work. But yeah, it was really interesting, but it was a real challenge right at the start, just to get people engaged.
Thank you. And thank you, Alan, for that sort of lovely wide open question. The next question comes from Stuart McIntosh. How should Fox application developers engage with NHS Wales and help create apps for the platform? John, do you want to pick up first?
Oh, that's a big question. That's a very big question. As I said, we're approaching this in a stepwise way, and in the first instance, we're working with internal developers to deliver on a couple of key use cases. We would like to continue working with ecosystem to basically allow us to feedback our progress as we go ahead, because our initial program that takes us through, till the late summer is kind of fixed to a certain extent. But after that, we're looking to support NDR use cases, and cardiology is one of those in a more of a greenfield kind of way. Because one of our issues is developing that internal resource. We need to make sure there's a support layer that's currently there, that the developers are trained up, etc., etc. That if at 4 a.m. the CDR goes down, somebody's picking up the phone and making sure it's going to be looked after and everything's going to be fine. So my experience working with NHS Wales is we tend to go big bang, and then it's like, oh, hang on a second, we haven't got enough people to do this or that, and we're headless chicken for a little bit. So we're deliberately tackling that in a small way. So in the first instance, Stuart, probably very little you can do to support us, other than to stay tuned to the feedback that we hopefully gonna be able to deliver, working with our wider.
And I think John's been booted again.
I might just, while we're waiting for him to come back, I think Stuart makes a good. I think one of the things I've recognised when you're going for this kind of platform move, there's a few moving parts. So you definitely need the platform, but until you have the platform, you won't get apps developers to build for it. But the platform doesn't seem very attractive if there's no apps for it. So there's a bit of a sort of dance that's going on at the moment, but I'm really encouraged by, behind the scenes, quite a number of vendors, some new vendors, SMEs, people that are new to the market, and Stuart's company would be, relatively speaking, in that space. But other people who you would say are typical healthcare application vendors who do things their own way, but actually have been willing to see the potential and engage and say, okay, let's play around with replatforming our software on openEHR. Maybe not for everybody, but certainly for places like Wales and Catalonia and Scotland and Finland who want to play that way. Of course, there is always that separate discussion as well, as are we going to build our own apps? As I think there's more of an inclination to do that in Wales versus to go out to the market, and that is just for the platform provider to decide the best mix. I certainly think that the attractive thing is that we can have lots of different apps from different providers, commercial or otherwise, and it's the platform that matters, not the apps ultimately, but we need the apps to prove that this works.
And Hannah commented in the chat that in Finland they originally had 2 companies building on openEHR, and now it's up to 11, and also made a comment about how that stakeholder engagement, wide stakeholder engagement, in order for the regional country to be successful is really important. And what we're doing today is part of that process. But John, have you got any ideas on how we can engage wider, or Jonathan, on what our next steps are to make this easier to understand? And Jonathan, having gone through the process himself recently.
I would just reiterate, I think there's an important educational aspect needed for openEHR and anything similar. So clinicians need to be educated on what it is and what its potential is. And I think that's what's been missing. And given that the current generation coming through are people who are used to using computers all their lives, and devices, etc., then it's no big step. So I think it probably needs to be part of our training within medicine, the use of information systems, because I think it's missed out, and it's a really important part of working life.
Yeah, just if I can add to that, just something I meant to say during my slide. I was very conscious when I was doing the research for that long COVID thing. I consulted the NICE guidelines, and I have to say there is nothing about the informatics in there. They're kind of vague things about what kind of information you might use or might record, but there's nothing pinned down. And I think professionally we need to start saying, anytime somebody writes a guideline, just as if you write an academic paper, you have a statistician on board. If you write a guideline, you should have an informatician, at least one informatician on board, guiding you how to have the data structured and make it usable in real systems, because we don't get that from our clinical guidelines community at the moment.
Okay, final question as we're coming towards the end. From Matthew McCarthy. Could semi-clinical information such as patient safety incident reports theoretically be stored against a patient record via openEHR? Having incident data in the same place as the patient's health records would open up huge possibilities for analysing and hopefully preventing patient safety issues. It's a quite specific question, but I don't know, John or Ian, if you want to kick off with answering that.
I don't mind having a go, and then John could come in. So I think it's an interesting idea. I think that it does highlight we need to be careful. openEHR is not a panacea. It is about the patient record. So, there's many other parts. John alluded to this. There are many other parts in a real world application. There's the demographics, there's the healthcare providers and organizations. If you're doing resourcing, let's say for theatre management, scheduling, none of that's really held in openEHR. So it's all about the patient record. But this could be done in the patient record. I think most of it. Some of it might be things that are about ward processes and procedures, maybe not, but certainly the patient safety aspects, yeah, definitely.
John, any comment?
Yeah, it's one of the things we're hitting at the moment. We're getting an interface feed from a system that contains both admin and clinical data, and at what point do we want to start storing data such as demographics, for example, in the CDR when that's not its primary purpose? We have to have our eyes open about this, and I suppose reiterating Ian's point, openEHR is not a panacea. It does one thing really well: storing structured clinical data. Let's use it for that, and not make life difficult or shoot ourselves in the foot long term by pretending it's something that it's not.
Yeah, just in the message, I just pinged up a little archetype. I think I might have been involved in the early days of this. But anyway, it uses the CTCAE, which is common terminology, criteria for adverse events. So it has, we're moving into that space in terms of patient safety events reporting.
And it's maybe something that we can explore in more detail at the next session. So we have a technical event next Tuesday, same time, 10 a.m, where we're going to more technical detail around openEHR. Everybody here is obviously welcome to attend. And the information is available on the DHEW website, which is digitalhealth.wales/DHEW. You can find out how to register for the event or pass the details on to your colleagues. And we look forward to seeing you all then on Tuesday. But before we wrap up, I'd just like to give, and the link is actually in the chat. So first of all, I want to give a big thank you to Catherine, who is part of the team that has made the event happen today. And a big thank you to our speakers, to Ian, to John and to Jonathan. And to thank you all for your participation through Mentimeter, through the questions. And, the chat has really shown, I think, the value of the event today. And John, you want to just quickly say a few words?
Yeah, just, obviously, by all means, welcome to attend next week as well. But, as I mentioned right up front, this is about this ongoing journey with us as we explore this approach. And, your voices are very important in regards to that. So if there is an appetite for further discussion, for example, user groups or whatever it happens to be, by all means, get in touch, and maybe that's something we can coordinate with the ecosystem team as well.
Absolutely, very happy to get in touch with us, or if you know John, to get in touch with John directly. We'll arrange. All feedback is passed through, and thank you all for attending this event, and hopefully we'll see most of you on Tuesday.